I had some comment that was like, hey, you should be more organized. So I wrote down my notes on a piece of 10mm foam. Hey guys, Sash from Master Warrior Props. Welcome down to the shop. Guess who's behind the camera for the first time in like 2 years now, babe?
Probably longer.
Yeah. Today, I wanted to do something a little different. I want to put the focus of the channel not just on tutorials, but skills and, you know, learning processes that are more than just for a single prop. Because I'm not teaching you much if I'm just saying, oh, hey, here's how you build this sword. I want to go over techniques and stuff that I've learned over the years, basic 101 stuff. Today I want to talk about sanding. Sanding is something that every craftsman field should be familiar with, be it props, woodworking, metalworking. It goes with literally every sort of craft ever. Sanding, polishing, refining, it's there, and not a whole lot of people understand the foundations before they get into it. So without further ado, let's get straight into the video with what is sanding. There's two types of sanding. There's stock removal, which is simply taking material away from the item that you're working on, and then there's refining and polishing. Polishing kind of leans more into a different section, so we're going to today just mostly talk about stock removal and refining. The basic rule with sanding is the lower the grit, the more material you're going to be taking away. So you're talking about like your 60s, your 80s, up to your 100s is what I would consider pretty low grit. The general theory behind it is the rougher the grit, the more material it's taking away, whereas something higher is mostly just taking away the texture and removing a lot less. For instance, if you're doing something like a hard plastic or a woodworking, you could sometimes see yourself working up to 800 to 1000 grit. When I was an automotive tech, when I would polish headlights, I would start at 800 and move up to 1000, 1500, 2000, and then 3000, and it'd become crystal clear. Let's get a little bit of demonstration underway of what I'm talking about. So for something like we have 80 grit here, I'll tear myself off a little piece just to show it better. This is a rougher finish. As you can see, these are all some Zelda props that I modeled in Fusion 360 and resin printed. In the refining process for something like this, there is a lot of hand sanding, whereas with foam and woodworking, there's a lot of machine sanding. So for a rougher grit, this is a pretty rough demonstration of what I want to talk about. So you'll see here, this is all coated in a filler primer. I've got one side that's relatively smooth and one side that is still pretty rough. So with your rough sanding, if I'm trying to take away the material, so for instance, I want to get this red coloring off and take it down to its bare material. And the best way to do that is this rougher grit. So you can go back and forth in really light rotations. You can also do little circular patterns. You do up and down, or you can also lay it out and then push against the paper itself, typically with a larger piece of paper. As you can see with that, you can see a rougher finish right around here. You can see the lines of where the grit has scraped the surface, which again, it did exactly what I needed it to do. It got rid of the surface material that I wanted gone, but it does leave me with this awful ugly texture. So that leads me into what we're going to talk about next with medium grit. We started out with an 80 grit sandpaper, which again, coarse for material removal. You can also get stuff like 180, 220, 120, which as you can see, some of them will say medium, smooths or fine, very fine, and whatever. It is different based on what you're working on, but again, the general rule, lower grit, more material is being removed. So we had 80, we can take a 220 piece, and the 220 will do a little bit of stock removal, but mostly help me get rid of that texture, which is what I want, is get rid of that initial pass of texture. As you can see with that pass, I don't have near as much surface marring from the rougher grit because again, you can see just a visible difference between 80 and 220. Once again, you can see how rough that is, and so, you know, just by common sense, you can tell that that's going to be harsher on the material you're working on. Again, you can do it with foam, plastics, woods, whatever. But once we've kind of taken it to 220, gives me a relatively nice surface finish, but because this is a gem that I want to mold and cast, I really want it super smooth. So what I can do is take myself up to 400. And in the hand sanding world, 400 is pretty fine. You can also get 600, 800, and again, up to 1000, just depending on what your surface finish desire is. 400 for this perspective is pretty okay. And once again, we're going to follow the same principles. With this, since I don't want to end up moving where my sanding lines are, I can just kind of place two fingers down like this, and then my piece, and back and forth, round, back and forth. And this one's a little bit harder to tell the difference for, but that is pretty, I mean, that's incredibly smooth, and especially once all the dust wipes away, and you can for sure feel the sharper edges around here. So that's just a basic understanding of rough to fine grit sandpaper. Before we go into wet and dry sanding, I do want to give a little bit more of a visual representation of the finishes between rough and fine. This is rough. You can really see on this piece of foam where the cells are and where the grit has really just dug in here and taken a lot away. You can see it gets really fuzzy, whereas even foam sanded at 600 is pretty much the surface finish of plastic. So once again, that's just a visual demonstration of what I'm trying to get across here. One more visual representation of rough and fine grit. This was only sanded at up to 120. And you can really see it's not shiny. You can see all of where those grit marks were. And once again, that's not the finish I want for this type of prop. But if you're doing something like a wood grain, I've often done something like that. Whereas this was finished at a surface sanding of 800. It's still just a little tacky, but you can really see it's shiny. The finish left this shiny. Whereas this is dry and it's pretty dull. We can talk about more like finished surfaces and stuff if we talk about clear coats, but this is the general idea of low and high grit. Let's talk about wet and dry sanding. What is wet and dry sanding? It's simply the process of just add water. To break it down into layman's terms, it does keep your sanding sanding job cleaner. It does keep it a little more, like it keeps your paper for sure a little cleaner. Like when I wet sand, I keep the paper way longer than I do when I dry sand. The methods are still the same, and I will show you what to do if you don't have a shop sink. I'm still in the process of installing my shop sink, and I'm going to show you exactly what I do when I wet sand without something like a high pressure system of water. For a demonstration of wet and dry sanding, this is my Ocarina of Time boss key. So again, I've sanded on this a little bit. This isn't mostly talking about finish. This is strictly talking about methodology at this point. So I've got a higher grit, and I'm going to show you what it does to the paper and finish, and then you can kind of decide for yourself what you use for each prop. Again, it really depends. You just have to get a feel for the methods and the practices and kind of implement them once you get a better feel. There's real no right or wrong here. So let's get straight into this. Gonna keep following my same methods as before. Up and down, little circles. And I can already see as I keep sanding, I'm taking away less and less material. Number one, I am using a higher grit, so that's the culprit. However, when I turn this paper over, you'll see all of that, this is my pressure areas, right here and here, all of that is really gummed up, and when I feel it, and you can even kind of see it a little bit, the grit is not as prominent here anymore, and that would be because it's getting so caked up with whatever I'm sanding off of it. So the process of wet sanding is simply keeping your paper just a little bit cleaner. So I will do my wet sanding on this side. For wet sanding without a high pressure, faucet or valve system, I have this old water bottle that I saw in the trash and decided that, I can make it high pressure. I don't know if the holes will show up here, but I just poked some holes in the top of the lid so that way if I squeeze hard enough, it'll spray. So what you can do for starters is get your pieces a little wet and come at it. Oh, I'll use the clean piece. And you can see it's keeping the material itself. I am collecting gunk right there, but it's still taking some away without gumming up the paper entirely. And then once you've kind of done a few passes, you can wash this off, squeeze the bottle, and because I've got the paper towel here, I'll wipe that off. And you can see, well, the feeling is going to be a little different. It is incredibly smooth. It is smoother than what the dry at 400 was. And I can take my water, wet the paper a little bit, and the paper is squeaky clean again. So again, that is just the rough concept of wet versus dry sanding. Wait, that's Final Fantasy. Oops. Come here. Come here, puppy. You want to say hey to everybody? There's my big baby. But those 65 pound baby. Oh, thank you. Love you too. So that pretty much covers an intro to sanding. Look, I followed my notes. I am organized. Ryan, can you do like the comment, like opacitized, whatever that term is, like over my face. The one thing I didn't cover that I did put on my notes is polish. Polish is a different kind of sanding, and we can go into that at a later term. It is for something once you've gotten a little more advanced. Polishing is kind of the last step for certain things, not all things, whereas something like this Moonlight Greatsword from Dark Souls 1 had a lot of sanding like what I've just shown you. A lot of rough sanding, trim down, and then finish sanding. But there will not be polish on this type. Again, you'll get a feel for it as you progress in your prop making field. But I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in another video. Next time, I want to talk about machine sanding and different kinds of sanding machines and power sanding tools. Just kind of move into that. After that, expect some tips and tricks with different methods and whatever. I would like to, again, show more techniques as well as tutorials. Tutorials are still going to stick around. But now that I've completely remodeled my shop and done a whole lot new, I'm set up more. So that should help a little bit when tutorials come back as well. But again, if you have a technique or a method or a tool that you'd like me to review or talk about, or different, whatever kind of techniques, cuttings, power tools, whatever, I'm happy to go into them. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. There is, as you, I don't know why I'm still holding that. What are you laughing at me for now? What'd I do? I'm just existing. My socials are all over the place. I'm on Facebook, and that's directly linked to my Instagram. Instagram is what I'm most active on. If you want to get in contact with me or have a question, comment, or whatever, shoot me an email. There's an email linked on my website, as well as my Instagram DMs. That's what I answer the most. That's what I'm most active on. Without further ado, that's done with the video. Without further ado, we're done with the video. Hope you had a good one. And, yeah.